The emergency room at Mercy General never sleeps. And tonight, neither will the man sitting in Trauma Bay 4, wearing a tailored black overcoat and eyes that have already decided someone's fate. But first, the moment that changed everything. 4 hours and 59 minutes. That is how long Anetta Cole has endured the storm. She stands at the station, deep brown skin glowing under the harsh fluorescence, her natural hair pulled into a tight, professional bun. She is the anchor of this ER, the one who keeps the chaos from collapsing. She tries to ignore the venomous shouting behind her. Gerald Whitmore, a billionaire donor in a wrinkled hospital gown, looks at her not as a healer, but as a servant. His face is a roadmap of red-faced rage, teeth clenched as he leans forward, invading her space. No one dares interrupt a man with his bank account. No one has until he does the unforgivable. His hand snaps out, clenching her scrubs, his face twisted in a sneer as he screams a slur that makes the entire ER go cold. Pens drop. Monitors beep louder in the sudden, terrifying silence. Anetta doesn't scream. She doesn't flinch. She just goes very, very still. In the shadowed corner of the adjacent bay, Kang Jae-Min watches. His tattooed fingers curl slowly around the armrest, the ink on his knuckles catching the clinical light. He isn't a patient. He isn't staff. He is a predator who has just found his prey. Who is he? Why is he here? And what happens the second he stands up? Stay, because what explodes next isn't just drama, it's war. The digital clock on the wall pulsed with a rhythmic, clinical indifference. 5 hours and 12 minutes. For Anetta, the air in the ER had grown thick, saturated with the smell of antiseptic and the mounting rot of Gerald Whitmore's entitlement. I said this tea is cold. Gerald's voice didn't just ring, it scraped against the nerves of every person in the trauma bay. He sat upright in his gown, the fabric straining against his agitated movements. His face was a map of broken capillaries and high society fury. Are you deaf as well as incompetent? I want a new tray, and I want it now. Anetta didn't look up from the monitor she was checking, though her fingers trembled slightly as she adjusted the IV flow. Mr. Whitmore, I have already explained that your procedure requires you to fast. Giving you more fluids right now is a safety risk. I need you to stay calm. Don't you tell me to be calm. Gerald's clutched the plastic meal tray, a remnant of his lunch before the fast was ordered, and hurled it. It wasn't a clumsy toss. It was a targeted strike. The tray caught Anetta squarely in the shoulder, the remaining dregs of lukewarm broth splashing across her pristine blue scrubs, soaking into the fabric like a badge of shame. The plastic clattered to the floor, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the sudden silence of the unit. Anetta froze. The liquid was warm, but her blood felt like ice. She looked down at the mess on her chest, then slowly at Gerald. Her breath hitched, a small, trapped sound in the back of her throat. Before she could speak, footsteps hurried toward them. It wasn't security. It was Mrs. Gable, the night supervisor, her face tight with a different kind of fear, the fear of a lost donation. She didn't look at the stain on Anetta's uniform. She didn't look at the tray on the floor. She looked only at Gerald. Mr. Whitmore, please, we are so sorry for the distress, Gable cooed, her voice a sickly sweet syrup. Then she turned to Anetta, her eyes hardening into flint. Anetta, look at what you've done. You've upset him. Just apologize so we can move past this and keep the peace. Anetta felt the world tilt. Apologize, Mrs. Gable, he threw. I don't care about the tray, Anetta, Gable whispered sharply, leaning in close enough for Anetta to smell the stale coffee on her breath. He is a cornerstone of this hospital's funding. You are a nurse. Do your job. Swallow your pride and apologize, or I will have your credentials on my desk by morning. Anetta looked at the supervisor, then back at Gerald, who was wearing a triumphant, ugly smirk. The endurance that had held her together for 5 hours began to fray. She felt small, diminished to nothing more than a servant in a house she helped keep standing. But in the silence that followed, the curtain of the adjacent bay rustled. A shadow moved, heavy, deliberate, and cold. The peace Gable was so desperate to keep was about to be shattered by a man who didn't care about donations. The air in the trauma bay didn't just feel cold. It felt thin, as if the oxygen was being sucked out of the room by the sheer weight of Gerald Whitmore's arrogance. Anetta stood motionless, the lukewarm broth from the thrown tray dripping from her scrubs onto the linoleum floor with a slow, rhythmic tap. Gable's demand for an apology hung in the air like a noose. Encouraged by the supervisor's spinelessness, Gerald's face contorted into something truly demonic. He didn't just want her words, he wanted her soul crushed. "Did you hear her, girl?" he hissed, his voice trembling with a manic, unchecked power. "Apologize. Get on your knees and scrub this mess off the floor, or I'll make sure you never handle a bandage in this city again." He lunged forward, his right hand whistling through the air in a blind, backhanded arc aimed at Anetta's face. Anetta flinched, her eyes snapping shut as she braced for the impact that had felt inevitable for the last 5 hours. The slap never landed. Instead, a sound like a dry branch snapping echoed through the bay, not the sound of a bone breaking, but the sound of momentum being murdered. Anetta opened her eyes and saw Gerald frozen in midair. His hand was inches from her cheek, held captive by a grip so absolute it looked like he had been caught in a vice. Kang Jae-Min had moved with the silent, terrifying efficiency of a shadow. He didn't look like a patient anymore. He stood a full head taller than Gerald, his broad shoulders filling the narrow space between the beds. His black trench coat was draped over his shoulders like a shroud, and his shirt was partially open, revealing the dark, intricate ink of a dragon's tail coiling up his collarbone. The grip of iron was visible on his knuckles, tattooed, scarred, and white with tension. He held Gerald's wrist with a terrifying stillness. Gerald struggled, his face turning from red to a sickly, pale gray as he realized his strength meant nothing against the man who had appeared from the dark. "In my world," Jae-Min said, his voice a low, melodic vibration that seemed to make the very floorboards hum, "we have a specific way of handling those who mistake kindness for weakness." The entire ER went into a vacuum of silence. The beeping monitors felt like they were coming from another planet. Mrs. Gable took a stumbling step back, her mouth working but no sound emerging. Jae-Min didn't even look at her. His narrow, intense eyes remained fixed on Gerald's clattering teeth. Slowly, Jae-Min rotated Gerald's arm, forcing the older man to lean back until he was staring at the ceiling, his knees buckling. Then, Jae-Min turned his gaze toward Anetta. It wasn't the look of a savior. It was the look of a predator acknowledging a survivor. In that silent exchange, the power at Mercy General didn't just shift, it died and was reborn in the hands of a ghost. The pressure in Kang Jae-Min's grip increased by a fraction of a millimeter, but it was enough to send Gerald Whitmore to his knees. The wealthy man's breath came in ragged, wet hitches, his arm trembling under the absolute stillness of the man standing over him. Jae-Min didn't yell. He didn't need to. In the world he governed, volume was for the weak. True power lived in the quiet that preceded the storm. Jae-Min leaned down, his face inches from Gerald's ear. He spoke in a low, melodic rasp, the sounds of his native Korean cutting through the sterile ER air like a serrated blade. "Giman du mat han nam," he whispered, the syllables heavy and cold. "Neonun dashinun I sunny euro nugu du manjai mat haji dol geoda." Gerald blinked, his eyes darting around in terror, searching for help that wasn't coming. The hospital staff stood like statues, paralyzed by the sheer predatory aura radiating from the man in the black coat. Even Mrs. Gable had retreated into the shadows of the nurse's station, her clipboard clutched to her chest like a shield. Jae-Min shifted his gaze back to Gerald, his expression as unreadable as a tombstone. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly soft English translation. "I told you that you are less than a dog, and I promised you that you will never use this hand to touch another soul again." He looked at Gerald's fingers, the ones that had been inches from Anetta's face, with the clinical curiosity of a butcher. "You believe your money makes you a god here," Jae-Min continued. His thumb pressing into a specific nerve cluster in Gerald's wrist that made the older man's eyes roll back. "But money only buys silence from cowards. It does not buy safety from me. By sunrise, the world will know exactly what you are. And if you even breathe the same air as this woman again, I will not bother with words." Jae-Min released him then, not with a shove, but with a casual flick of his wrist as if he were discarding a piece of trash. Gerald slumped against the side of his hospital bed, his aggressive fire completely extinguished, replaced by a cold, primal fear that left him shivering. Jae-Min turned his back on the broken man, dismissing him entirely. He looked at Anetta, who was still standing by the monitor, the broth stain drying on her scrubs. For the first time, the icy mask on his face flickered. He didn't offer a comforting smile. He wasn't a man capable of such things, but the intense, narrow focus of his eyes held a silent promise of protection that no supervisor or security guard could ever provide. The god of the ER had been humbled, and the king of the city's shadows had just declared his territory. Without another word, Jae-Min straightened his trench coat and walked back toward his bay, leaving the silence to ring louder than any scream. The silence following Jae-Min's departure didn't last. In the sterile vacuum of the ER, the vacuum was quickly filled by the frantic, high-pitched damage control of the administration. Anetta stood by the nurse's station, her body vibrating with a delayed shot of adrenaline, expecting justice. Instead, she found herself summoned to a windowless office on the 4th floor barely an hour later. The air in the boardroom was stagnant, smelling of old coffee and expensive leather. Mrs. Gable sat in the corner, her eyes fixed on her sensible shoes, while 3 men in charcoal suits, members of the hospital board, stared at Anetta as if she were a glitch in an otherwise perfect system. "Mr. Whitmore's legal team has already contacted us," the man in the center said, his voice as dry as parchment. He didn't mention the tray throwing. He didn't mention the hours of abuse. "They are alleging that you conspired with an outside element to assault a patient under our care. They're calling it a security breach, a targeted intimidation." Anetta felt a cold, hollow sensation open up in her chest. "He tried to hit me. He has been screaming at me for 5 hours. That man..." He just stopped him. "That man is a ghost with a criminal record that could sink this hospital's reputation," the board member snapped, leaning forward. "By being associated with him, you've turned a patient complaint into a liability. To protect the sanctity of Mercy General and appease the Whitmore family, we are placing you on immediate, indefinite suspension, pending an internal investigation into your conduct." "Suspension?" Anetta's voice was a whisper, the word tasting like ash. "I did my job. I stayed when everyone else walked away from him." "You should have been more professional, Anetta," Mrs. Gable added, her voice trembling but compliant. "You shouldn't have let it escalate." The betrayal was a physical weight, heavier than the tray Gerald had hurled at her. They weren't just taking her shift, they were taking her dignity to balance a checkbook. Anetta didn't wait for them to finish. She turned and walked out, the fluorescent lights of the hallway blurring into long, jagged streaks of white. She gathered her bag from the locker room, her movements mechanical. As she pushed through the heavy glass doors of the main entrance, the night air hit her, damp and indifferent. The endurance she had worn like armor for years finally shattered. Standing on the sidewalk, under the cold glow of the hospital's sign she had served so faithfully, the first sob broke through. She walked toward the bus stop, hot tears streaming down her face, her shoulders shaking with the realization that in the eyes of the powerful, she was entirely expendable. She felt small, discarded, and utterly alone in the dark, unaware that across the street, the engine of a sleek black sedan was purring, and a pair of intense, narrow eyes were tracking every tear. The humid night air clung to Anetta like a second skin, heavy with the salt of her tears and the stinging memory of the board's betrayal. She walked with her head down, the bright, red neon sign of Mercy General fatting behind her, casting a long, bloody shadow across the pavement. Every footfall felt hollow, as if the ground itself had lost its solidity. 5 years of service, thousands of lives touched, all discarded in a 15-minute meeting to protect a monster's bank account. As she reached the edge of the hospital block, the streetlights flickered, and a low, rhythmic hum vibrated through the soles of her shoes. A sleek, obsidian black sedan sat idling at the curb, its engine purring with a predatory growl. It was a vehicle that didn't belong in this neighborhood, too polished, too expensive, and far too dangerous. The windows were tinted to a deep, impenetrable midnight, reflecting nothing but the cold city lights. The rear door clicked open, with a sound like a chambered round. A man stepped out, but it wasn't the giant from the ER. This man was younger, leaner, dressed in a sharp gray suit that looked like it cost more than Anetta made in a year. He didn't move toward her aggressively. Instead, he stood by the open door with a disciplined, military stillness. His hands were clasped in front of him, and his expression was a mask of professional neutrality. "Ms. Cole," he said, his voice clipped and resonant. It wasn't a question. Anetta stopped, wiping a stray tear from her cheek with the back of her hand, her pulse quickening. "I don't know you." "You don't," the assistant conceded, a slight bow of his head acknowledging her wariness. "But my employer knows you. He saw what happened in Trauma Bay 4, and he saw what happened in the boardroom 10 minutes ago." Anetta felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night breeze. The reach of the man with the tattoos was apparently longer than she had imagined. "If this is about the police or the hospital board, I've had enough for one night." "This is about justice, Ms. Cole," the man replied, his eyes finally meeting hers. They were steady, devoid of the pity she had seen in Mrs. Gable's gaze. "Mercy General is preparing to bury your career. Gerald Whitmore has already hired a firm to ensure you are blacklisted from every hospital in the state. My employer, Mr. Kang, does not like it when the balance of power is so unrefined." He gestured to the plush, leather interior of the car. "He is waiting. He has the evidence the hospital deleted, and he has a proposition that will ensure Mr. Whitmore regrets more than just his cold tea. You can get on that bus and disappear, or you can get in this car and fight." Anetta looked at the flickering lights of the bus stop, then back at the dark mouth of the sedan. The practical nurse in her screamed to run, but the woman who had been handled like trash wanted to be heard. She took a breath, stepped toward the car, and entered the shadow. The interior of the sedan was a sanctuary of hushed luxury and cold intent, smelling of expensive leather, and the faint, metallic tang of a life lived in the shadows. As the car glided through the city, the neon lights of the skyline streaked across the dark wood paneling like liquid gold. Kang Jae-Min sat in the far corner of the rear seat, his silhouette a sharp-edged monument of stillness. He didn't look at Anetta as she entered. He remained focused on a thin, glowing tablet in his lap, his tattooed knuckles pale against the device. The hospital's internal server was purged at 11:42 p.m., Jae-Min said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to settle in the very marrow of Anetta's bones. "They think the footage of Gerald Whitmore's hands on you no longer exists. They believe that without visual proof, you are just a woman with a grudge against a benefactor." Anetta clutched her bag to her chest, her voice small but steady. "And does it exist?" Jae-Min turned the screen toward her. On it, the ER footage played in crystal-clear high definition. The moment the tray hit her, the moment Gerald lunged, and the moment Jae-Min's hand closed around his wrist like a trap. "My people do not rely on hospital servers, Ms. Cole. I have the truth. But truth is a fickle weapon against a man like Whitmore. To break him, you need more than a record of his temper. You need his pulse." He swiped the screen, and a cascade of spreadsheets, offshore account numbers, and scanned documents filled the display. Anetta's eyes widened as she scanned the names of shell companies and diverted charity funds. "This is my ledger," Jae-Min continued, his eyes narrowing. "Gerald Whitmore isn't just a rude man with a high donation count. He is a parasite, for 3 years. He has been using Mercy General's expansion fund to wash capital from illegal land grabs in the East. He doesn't give to this hospital out of the goodness of his heart. He gives to it because it is his laundry mat." He leaned forward, the light from the tablet catching the intensity of his gaze. The air between them grew heavy, charged with a dangerous opportunity. The hospital board isn't protecting a donor, they are protecting a co-conspirator. These are the bullets, Anetta. This information is enough to turn his legal team into a funeral procession and burn the board's reputations to ash. He slid the tablet across the seat toward her. "I am offering you the chance to pull the trigger. You can use this to win your case, reinstate your license, and take everything he owns. But once you use my ledger, you are no longer just a nurse. You are an associate of the Solite. You are stepping into my world." Anetta looked at the glowing numbers, the physical proof of the rot that had tried to consume her. She looked at Jae-Min's scarred hands, then back at the screen. The path of the practical nurse had led her to a tear-stained sidewalk. This path, however, led to a throne of retribution. Slowly, her fingers closed around the edge of the tablet. The glass doors of Mercy General slid open with a hiss, but the woman who stepped through them didn't look like the nurse who had been escorted out in tears 48 hours ago. Anetta Cole walked with a spine of forged steel, her light blue scrubs replaced by a sharp, tailored charcoal suit. To her left and right walked two men whose presence felt like a sudden drop in barometric pressure. The city's most formidable litigators, men whose names usually appeared on the letterheads of firms that terrified corporate boards. The lobby fell into a stunned, rhythmic silence. The staff behind the reception desk froze, their eyes widening as they recognized the suspended nurse returning like a returning conqueror. They were met at the executive elevators by Mrs. Gable and the head of risk management, a man named Henderson who clutched a leather-bound folder as if it were a shield. "Anetta," Gable started, her voice trembling with a mix of condescension and growing panic. "We told you to wait for the official summons. This spectacle is unnecessary. We've prepared a very generous settlement." "The spectacle hasn't even begun," one of the lawyers replied, his voice a smooth, icy baritone that cut Gable off mid-sentence. They were led into the same boardroom where Anetta's dignity had been auctioned off 2 nights prior. On the polished mahogany table sat a single document, a non-disclosure agreement. Henderson pushed it toward her, his face a mask of false sympathy. "We're prepared to offer you 3 years' salary and a neutral reference," Henderson said, tapping the paper. "All you have to do is sign this NDA. We'll call it a misunderstanding, Gerald Whitmore withdraws his complaint, and we all move on. It's the practical choice, Anetta." Anetta looked at the document. She could smell the ink, the scent of a bribe designed to bury the truth. She thought of the 5 hours of abuse, the tray hitting her shoulder, and the way the board had looked at her as if she were a piece of malfunctioning equipment. Then she thought of the glowing ledger in Jae-Min's car, the bullets he had handed her. She didn't reach for the pen. Instead, she leaned forward, her eyes locking onto Henderson's with a clarity that made him flinch. "You want me to sign away my voice to protect a man who launders money through your pediatric wing?" Anetta's voice was quiet, but it filled the room like a physical weight. Henderson's face went the color of ash. I don't know what you're talking about." "My client isn't signing anything," her lead lawyer intervened, sliding a different folder across the table, one containing the encrypted evidence of Whitmore's fraud and the hospital's complicity. "In fact, we aren't here to negotiate your settlement. We're here to inform you that the press is waiting downstairs, and the state attorney has already received a copy of what's in that file." Anetta stood up, looking down at the board members who had tried to erase her. "I used to be a practical nurse," she said, her voice resonant and final. "But I've learned that peace bought with silence isn't peace at all. It's a cage, and I'm done being locked in." She turned and walked out, leaving the NDA unsigned on the table, a useless piece of paper in a room that was beginning to burn. The legal system was a sledgehammer, but Kang Jae-Min's world operated with the silent, invisible precision of a garrote. While Anetta's lawyers dismantled the hospital board in the light of the mahogany boardroom, Jae-Min's, shadows, began a much quieter demolition in the city's high-rise offices and exclusive private clubs. Gerald Whitmore had spent decades building a fortress of influence, believing his wealth was an unbreakable wall. He didn't realize that in Jae-Min's city, influence was a currency that could be devalued in a single night. As the sun began to set on the day of the confrontation, the first tremors hit. In a high-end steakhouse across town, Gerald's primary investor received a single, encrypted file on a burner phone. It wasn't a threat. It was a courtesy. It contained the same ledger Anetta had seen, the offshore accounts, the diverted charity funds, and the direct links to the East's most dangerous land grabs. By the time the investor reached his dessert, he had already instructed his firm to sever all ties with Whitmore Holdings. The contagion spread with terrifying speed. In the shadows of the city's digital architecture, Jae-Min's specialists worked like ghosts. They didn't need to hack. They simply leaked the truth to the people who feared scandal more than they valued loyalty. By By midnight, Gerald's phone had become a graveyard of ignored calls and access denied notifications. His partners, men who had toasted to his success just days prior, moved with the frantic energy of rats sensing a sinking ship. They didn't just walk away. They ran, issuing public statements of reevaluating corporate alignments before the first morning additions could even hit the stands. The bank accounts that Gerald had used to threaten Anetta were frozen by dawn, tied up in a web of compliance reviews triggered by anonymous tips to the federal authorities. Gerald sat in his penthouse, the very air in the room feeling thinner, his power evaporating like mist in a gale. He looked at the television, where a news ticker already ran the headline, "Whitmore Empire Collapses Amid Fraud Allegations." He had spent 5 hours bullying a nurse because he thought she was small. He had spent a lifetime believing he was too big to fall. He was wrong on both counts. Across the city, in the back of the black sedan, Jae-Min watched the flashing stocks on his tablet. He didn't smile. He simply tapped a button, closing the file. The shadows had finished their work. Gerald Whitmore was no longer a benefactor, a billionaire, or a threat. He was a man standing alone in a cold, expensive room, waiting for the sound of the police at his door. The balance of power hadn't just shifted, it had been deleted. The fluorescent lights of Mercy General had never seemed brighter, casting a cold, unforgiving glare on the final act of Gerald Whitmore's reign. The lobby, usually a place of quiet murmurs and hurried footsteps, was thick with the heavy silence of a crowd watching a king fall. Gerald wasn't shouting anymore. The man who had spent 5 hours terrorizing Anetta Cole now looked small, his expensive silk shirt wrinkled and his face a sickly, ashen gray. His hands, the same hands that had lunged for Anetta's throat, were now hidden behind his back, bound by polished steel. 2 federal agents led him toward the sliding glass doors, their movements efficient and devoid of the deference he had spent a lifetime buying. Every head in the ER turned. Doctors, orderlies, and patients watched as the billionaire donor was paraded through the very halls he thought he owned. He caught sight of Anetta standing near the nurse's station, her station. For a fleeting second, the old malice flickered in his eyes, but it died quickly, replaced by the realization that he was no longer a predator. He was evidence. Trailing behind the agents was Mrs. Gable. She wasn't in handcuffs, but her face held a similar look of ruin. A man from the new interim board walked beside her, his voice low and final as he handed her a security envelope. "Your services are no longer required, effective immediately," the board member said, loud enough for the staff to hear. "The hospital is cooperating fully with the investigation into the suppressed footage and the financial irregularities you facilitated." Gable didn't argue. She didn't look at Anetta. She simply clutched her purse to her chest and followed the agents out, a ghost departing a house she had helped haunt. Anetta stood her ground, her chin tilted up. The weight that had been pressing down on her chest since the first hour of Gerald's bullying finally lifted. She watched the glass doors slide shut behind them, the sirens of the waiting police cruisers painting the lobby in rhythmic pulses of red and blue. The peace that Gable had tried to protect with lies had been replaced by a different kind of quiet, the clean, sharp stillness that follows a fever break. The hospital felt lighter, the air stripped of the rot. Anetta took a deep, steadying breath, feeling the fabric of her scrubs. They were clean. She was back, and for the first time in years, she wasn't just surviving the shift, she was commanding it. In the distance, through the glass, she saw the sleek black sedan pull away from the curb, its taillights disappearing into the city's heart. The reckoning was complete, but she knew the story wasn't over. The shadows had done their work, and now the light was finally hers to keep. 6 weeks later, the air at Mercy General felt different, cleaner, as if the very ventilation system had been purged of the old rot. Anetta walked through the double doors not as a survivor, but as a woman who had redefined the terms of her own existence. She wore her scrubs with a new kind of lightness, her natural hair pinned back with a confidence that no supervisor would ever dare to challenge again. The new administration had offered her a promotion, but she had declined. She stayed in the ER because she loved the work, not the title. Now, when she spoke, people listened. When she advocated for a patient, the board moved. She had become the sun around which the unit's integrity finally orbited. But as the sun began to dip below the skyline on a Tuesday evening, Anetta found herself far from the clinical hum of the hospital. She sat on a weathered wooden bench in a quiet corner of the city park, where the willow trees wept over a still pond and the city's roar was reduced to a distant, melodic hum. She didn't have to look back to know he was there. The temperature of the air seemed to shift, growing heavy and still. Kang Jae-Min stepped out from the deepening shadows of the trees, his black overcoat unbuttoned, his presence a dark anchor in the twilight. He sat at the far end of the bench, leaving a respectful distance, his tattooed hands resting quietly on his knees. "The hospital is quiet today," he said, his voice a low, gravelly vibration. "It's better," Anetta replied, looking at the way the orange light caught the ink on his knuckles. "I'm back, truly back. I wanted to thank you, Jae-Min, for the bullets, for everything." Jae-Min looked out at the water, his intense, narrow eyes reflecting the dying light. "I didn't give you anything you didn't already possess, Anetta. I simply provided the stage for you to stand on." He turned to her then, his stern expression softening into something raw and rare. "You are sunlight. I am only the one who clears the clouds." Anetta felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the evening breeze. She knew what he was, a man of shadows, a king of a world built on violence and secrets. To be near him was to walk the edge of a precipice. The practical nurse in her should have walked away, should have taken her victory and found a safe, quiet life. But she looked at his scarred hands and remembered the way they had held back the storm when she was drowning. She realized that safety was an illusion, but loyalty was a choice. "The clouds are gone," she whispered, reaching out and resting her hand over his. His skin was warm, his pulse steady and strong. "And I think I'm done being afraid of the dark." Jae-Min didn't smile, but his fingers closed around hers with a grip that was no longer iron, but silk. In the quiet of the park, between the healer and the predator, a new orbit began, one that was dangerous, impossible, and entirely theirs. Anetta leaned her head against his shoulder, finally deciding that for the first time in her life, the risk was worth the reward.